Hello, everybody, and welcome to GDG Dallas Meetup for July 2020. I am one of your organizers. My name is Luke, and we actually have on the call tonight Jacob, and we've got these other organizers that you can always reach out to through Meetup or Slack. We'll show some more information about that later. The Meetup site is down there. Do want to mention our sponsor, if you can call it that, is Bottle Rocket for using the Zoom. So it allows us to have, I think, up to 300 people. So if you're watching this and want to join us live, don't worry, there's room for you. I do want to mention our website. I don't mention this very much, but we actually have a website. It's gdgdallas.com. And right now, all it does is take you to our Meetup page, but we're always looking for help with that. And so if somebody would want to put together a website that kind of had links to all of our resources, to like our Slack and our YouTube channel, that would be great. But we understand, this is kind of a volunteer effort, and so we'd appreciate it. But if it's something you can either help us do or would like to do yourself, feel free to reach out. I will, like I mentioned, a Slack group. It's gdgdallas.slack.com. And you can actually get an invite by going to gdgdallasinvite.herokuapp.com, or just ping me in the chat. I'll try to drop one in the Zoom chat during the meetup for anybody who might need it. And we will have notes, probably including that URL, and the recording will be linked from the meetup page. We try to cross-link from every place that we have. Like we'll post in the Slack about the YouTube, and on the meetup page about the YouTube, and from the YouTube we link to the meetup and to the Slack. So we try to make sure that if you find one place, you can find all the others. But if you ever need help, feel free to reach out to me or one of the other organizers. And with that, we'll move on to our feature presentation. I will do a quick intro about our speaker for tonight. His name is Cameron Steele, and if you can see him. He comes to us from the great world of Windows XP, or at least that field where they got that cool background that everyone knows. But he's actually a multidisciplined engineer working at Raytheon Space and Airborne Systems, or as we all call it, DFW area, just Raytheon. And he's a senior at the University of Texas at Dallas studying Emerging Technologies at the ATEC program, which itself is another acronym for Arts Tech and Technology, something like that. Cameron can tell us more about it. He's also president of the UTDesign Makerspace and supports engineering projects under IEEE's Forge program. In his free time, as you can imagine, he has a lot with all of this going on. Cameron enjoys 3D printing, laser cutting, flying drones, tinkering with circuits, and projection mapping, all very cool technologies. I'm not sure how many of those he's going to involve in his presentation tonight, but I'm looking forward to it. So I'll turn it over to you, Mr. Cameron Steele.
All right, so my talk today is building smart homes with Home Assistant. So before we can talk about building them, we need to define what a smart home is. So if you go to Google and you search what is a smart home or just smart home, you'll get this definition. It's a home equipped with lighting, heating, and electronic devices that can be controlled remotely by phones or computers. I don't really care for that definition. It really excludes some of the more nuanced parts of what a smart home can be. And a lot of people don't use their smart homes to their full potential. But why would you even bother with a smart home? There's a few main reasons. My parents ask me this quite often when I'm tinkering with their home. And I usually say a couple of things. A, that it's economically and environmentally conscious, with smart lighting, smart blinds, smart power management systems, and even smart thermostats. We can easily make sure that we don't waste energy. We can cool our houses and still be comfortable while not using as much. So smaller electric bills and less impact on the earth, which is a great thing. something I only recently realized is just having some smart home tech in your house can increase the value of your home. For as little as $300, sometimes even lower, you can increase your value, your home's value by around 5%. So if you're selling a house for $300,000, that's like 15 grand, and that's nothing to scoff at. And in most cases, it's just like a smart thermostat or maybe some smart lights. But the market is actually really eager to adopt some of these technologies. Just most people don't feel comfortable pulling the trigger initially. Additionally, like the real reason most people do it is for increased convenience. And the idea is that you'll have more control over your time. You're not flipping the light switches. You're just telling Google or using an app to do it. And the real reason I got into it is it's fun. I'm a tech enthusiast, so I really enjoy tinkering with technology and making it my own. So what is Home Assistant? So Home Assistant is an open source home automation platform. It's written in Python and Polymer, which are two really cool technologies and language. And when they're combined, they build an open hub for managing the state of your home automation devices and to a more degree, automating these devices to work without you having to even tell it to do something. My favorite features about Home Assistant generally boil down to it has a fast release cycle, a bi-weekly updates. So you're always getting the best in speed, security, and always getting new features, whether that be new integrations for devices or just new quality of life things. Additionally, there are over 2,000 integrations. Every day people post more. And if there's something that doesn't exist already, you can always just write it in a multitude of ways. You can either write it in Python, and make it a native part of Home Assistant, or you can use the API with any language you want to get any kind of data talking. Additionally, it can run on a Raspberry Pi or basically any computer that runs Python. This includes virtual machines and Docker containers. It's not dependent on any kind of cloud services, and all storage is local. So you don't have to worry about, conspiracy theories about how Google or Facebook or whoever is using your data. Something that really struck me was the ability to bring in disparate hardware. So any kind of hardware you want, agnostic of protocols and technologies, or even ecosystems. A good example of that is I'm kind of a big Nest person. I have a lot of Google Home devices, cameras, all that, but I live in an apartment and there is really no good way of adding a doorbell to my apartment without, drilling it in or sticking it, and maybe it could get stolen. But Ring has a really nice peephole camera. And this camera just allows you to slide it into the door and no big hassle. And I was like, I'm really sad. I use Google Home stuff. I wish I could get all the features that maybe the Alexa devices get. But since that ecosystem is not the same, I would miss out. But through Home Assistant, I can make those features native, and they all run locally. And in some cases, it's faster than the official integrations, which is kind of funny. It can also run any kind of other smart home hubs you might have. So you don't have to be throwing away your Philips Hue bridge. Maybe you have Samsung Smart Things. You can usually integrate those pretty well as long as they're not super duper locked down. Additionally, on that note, you can bring in any item that you might have in Home Assistant to HomeKit. So if you have a device that might not be HomeKit compatible out of the box, it's very likely you'll be able to bring it in as more of a generic form of whatever it is. So if you have a light bulb, you could bring it in as just a generic light bulb to HomeKit, which is really cool. And after moving to iOS, it's kind of a big deal for me now. It works really well with a lot of the existing, voice assistants, Amazon Echo, Google Assistant, Siri with HomeKit. But the really cool thing is you could just host your own. Services like Snips.ai, Almond, and Hey Ada allow you to build an offline first artificial intelligence-based smart home. voice assistant, which is really cool. I like the fact that you can also bring in outdated old technologies or even devices that the manufacturer has specifically tried to discontinue. A really good example of that is the Amazon Dash button, which Amazon discontinued, but now finds new life with Home Assistant. It's pretty cool. It's also free and open source. I mentioned that before, and that's really cool because not only do you know what's running, you can always go to the GitHub page, you can make a feature request, you can fix something yourself, and when you're building on top of it, if there's something in the documentation that just isn't right or you don't understand well enough, you can go and inspect the code yourself. Another feature that a lot of even Home Assistant users kind of overlook is the ability to send notifications to all kinds of devices from one centralized location, whether that be your iPhone through push notifications or through email, through an SMTP server, or SMS, or there's all kinds of different ways of sending notifications. And usually building up the infrastructure to send push notifications can be a real pain, especially if you're working on a hobby maker home project. But with this, you can just send a request and it'll send to whichever device you want. They have a really big community as well on Discord, Reddit, and their own forum. A lot of people are really interested and passionate about these. They're posting their own setups. There's tons of people who can help you if you're having any trouble, and it's just a really awesome community. Additionally, when you want to interact with it, you can always use the iOS or the Android apps. They all work very well, or just the web interface from any web browser. And if you need to push data into it some other way, you can always use the API. So the real reasons I use Home Assistant is I wanted a privacy-focused smart home. I have a lot of use cases that normal consumer-grade smart home solutions don't really fit into. For instance, the other day, I kind of was bored and I set up a web app that allows people, anyone from the internet, to type in a message and click submit, and my Google Homes all over the house would read those messages out loud using the Google Translate text-to-speech API. I could talk about that for a lot, but that's the gist of it. And being able to build on top of Home Assistant made the development of that like super easy. It took about 15 minutes of code and a little bit of testing, and it worked great. I already mentioned the fact that being able to pull in outside ecosystem devices or just devices that don't have any kind of support in the main home, smart home scenes, specifically like DIY microcontroller-based IoT devices, or a lot of the open source projects that might be really niche, but definitely add a lot of value if that's what you're looking for. I like having a lot of really granular control over my smart home. You know, everything from being able to configure thousands of lines of automations that do exactly what I want when I want, being able to pull in custom data. For instance, I drive an electric scooter, and I wanted to be able to get information about it when I'm off of it and when it's docked at home. So I wrote an API integration that just pings the battery from BLE on the scooter, and it adds it to Home Assistant. And that's something I wouldn't have been able to get in any of the other platforms. And that kind of just ties into being able to build, you know, being a maker, being a tinkerer, and being able to, you know, prototype and build out ideas from start to finish with it. I do a lot of research, particularly with IoT and ambient computing, and this platform has been super useful for being able to prototype ambient UX experiences. So if you have any inclination in trying any of that, even if you're just kind of dipping your toes in it, it's a really great place to start. So integrations. I made this animation. I'm very proud of it. It took me a lot longer than it should have. But if you see anything, if you recognize any of these bubbles, then good news, Home Assistant works with that. This is only like like 50, 60 of the 2,000 plus integrations that exist, but these are some of my favorites. And I think it illustrates the diversity of Home Assistant. So an integration is just any kind of code that maps functionality of a foreign device to one of the archetypes, any of the device archetypes that Home Assistant has built in. Think light switches, binary sensors, temperature sensors, lights themselves, media control speakers, and basically everything in between. Integrations create devices, and devices map to entities in the code, and from there you have access to all kinds of different states. So for instance, my Ring doorbell has a state called ding dong, which is a binary sensor that tells you if the button has been pressed within 20 seconds of pull. So it's pretty cool, all the different stuff you can do. Installing integrations are super easy. Out of the box, it should discover any existing integration that it would be compatible with, and it will prompt you to just set it up. But otherwise, you can find it from a list, and usually there's a nice onboarding system for bringing it on. I'm adding a coronavirus analog sensor. I just added it, and from there, it created 4 entities, and I'll jump into that. And the 4 entities are confirmed, current, deaths, and recovered. And this is just a cool way of being able to inject data and compatibility with any other software you might be, software or hardware you might be working with. Unfortunately, not all integrations can be configured this easily. In some cases, you will have to go into a file called configurations.yaml, and from there, usually add 1 to 2 lines, the first line being usually the ID of the integration, followed by some keys that represent configuration details. But usually you don't even have to be a programmer to be able to do this, and the website has plenty of documentation on it. A cool note about the discovered integrations, which I can show here, is this is done through a combination of techniques, but mainly Bonjour and MDNS technologies. So it'll scan your network, listen for any kind of broadcasts, and it'll say, oh, I know this device, and it'll allow you to configure it. Google Home devices, for instance, Chromecast and Google Home devices work that same way. So if for some reason you don't have MDNS or Bonjour, any of those available through your network, you can always just add it through, but usually it should auto-detect it. A cool little look at how you can interact with devices that you've already pulled in. This is what a Google Home / a Chromecast device would look like. You have your quick view, your quick glance controller, so you can pause, play music. You can, and if you inspect for more data, you can get more granular control, as well as a graph that shows the state over time for an entity. And this applies to basically any kind of entity. It'll also have controls that are applicable to it. In this case, you can pause, play, you can turn it off if it's a TV, you can set the volume, and you can even type in a string, click send, and it will read out that message to that specific device, which is really cool. And in all of these integrations have API level functions and bindings that you can interact with through scripting. So you don't have to touch everything or click anything. It can all be done autonomously. So the real value in automating, or in Home Assistant, is automation. So once you have all your entities and devices connected, you can really start building out really rich automations. And automations offer the capability to call a service, usually based on a trigger of some kind. And then automations allow a condition, maybe sunset, to cause that event, and it could do something like turn off the lights, maybe lower your blinds, pull them up, do whatever you want. You can watch any kind of value and do something when it changes or when it goes within a threshold. But we'll look more into what the anatomy of these the automation platform is. So the anatomy of it, it's fairly simple. There's three parts. There's the trigger, one or more conditions that cause the automation to execute. So, a value changes. It could be the price of Bitcoin increases. And then your condition filters that code, filters that event to make sure it should actually be executing. So you could say if it's above $50 or $1 or whatever, then you could do some action. And actions are can be injected with templates, which allow you to inject variables or present data or do all kinds of really cool things with regex and arithmetic. And that's all done with Jinja 2, which is the templating platform that the templating engine that Home Assistant uses. So there's really three main ways of building automations with Home Assistant. You can, probably the least intuitive way is writing your automation in YAML within the automations.yaml file. The problem with that is if you're doing it with a text editor, you're not going to get any kind of real IntelliSense or any kind of help. So you're usually going in blind. So unless you know all the IDs and what the states are going to look like, you're probably going to have a pretty bad time doing it. Obviously, once you already have automations, usually it's fairly easy to go and tweak them using that method, but I don't really think it's the best way to create them. The second is the more recommended way, and it's using the Visual Automation Builder. And that builder also supports YAML, and we'll actually look at it in a minute, but it's really nice. It has like, it will auto-suggest field filling, and is a really nice way of doing it. Additionally, the third way, which is kind of an experimental way of doing it, is you can actually just write what you want your automation to be in plain English, and using what they call the Almond Automation Maker. It will try to convert using natural language processing. It'll try to generate an automation that you can go through and edit later. But unfortunately, it doesn't work super well at the moment. It's always getting better though. So maybe by the time you're listening to this, it works pretty well. So this automation builder looks like this. It's not like a node-based scripting. And it does support YAML, but it's very comprehensive and really nice. You give it a basic name and description, mostly for finding it later and possibly debugging. But from there, you have drop-downs for basically everything. So if I'm looking to have my trigger be when a device does something, I can say device, I can target the specific device, then I'll get a list of possible triggers and in some cases values. So like, if I'm targeting a device state, I can say if it goes from to or it just becomes out of nowhere, I can trigger it. From there, I can build conditions if needed. In most cases, I don't usually use conditions, but they can definitely be really helpful. Going with a automation that I currently run, having my Ring doorbell play a doorbell chime to all my Google Homes and send me a notification, I could definitely add in a condition that if it's past 9 o'clock, but it's before 8 a.m. or 6 a.m., I could make sure it mutes it, or it doesn't send, or it only sends me an email, or it turns on a light outside of my door, all kinds of really cool things. The things that you can do are only limited by what you can imagine. So the developer tools are also your friend, and you should definitely use them if you try doing this. They're really nice, and I wish a lot more systems had something like this. Through the developer tools, there are 4 main tabs. There's the state, the service, the templates, and events. Through states, you can look through all current entities that you have and be able to glance at their states and attributes that they may have with them. If there are mappable UI experiences for interacting with it, say you find a light bulb, you can click on it and it'll pull up the full light bulb editor. So, you have your colors, if it's a color bulb, brightness, and other things like that. And it's really nice for messing around and trying to prototype out your automations. I don't have pictures of these, but the services works similar. It has a list of domains and possible services, and you can go through them and you can test them and you can inject data. For instance, if I wanted to send a notification, I could call the notify service, and I could say notify.notify, which means notify all devices. And from there, I can inject the title and the message. I can click send, and I can notice that all my devices receive the notification. And that's really cool. There is a template playground, which allows you to write in that Jinja 2 templating language to practice and verify that your template strings are working properly. And that has saved me so much because I'm really bad at it. And being able to just verify that the variables are correct, or my math is right, or my regex is correct is really awesome. And finally, the events tab allows you to subscribe to internal Home Assistant events and get their data and get notified within the developer tools UI when an event gets fired. And you can even create mock events and check for those. So if you're building an automation, if you're building an add-on, if you're building a Docker system that will work on board, those are really good debugging tools. So what most people will see when they first use Home Assistant is known as Lovelace. It is the modular dashboard system for Home Assistant. It's pretty nice. The default theme it comes with is not, it leaves a lot to be desired, but you can easily configure it with CSS and HTML, and you can even build your own custom cards with JavaScript and other things like iframes, map views. And some people get really creative with these and build out really personalized, really beautiful dashboards that fit their exact needs. Not shown in this example is you can have tabs, and multiple users can have, or users can have their own unique tab that they default to. So for instance, if I was building this out for my parents' house, they probably don't care about a lot of the data that I would be caring about. They probably just want to see maybe a camera view, maybe a thermostat view so they can easily change it, and maybe some lights. But other than that, they probably don't care about that. But for me, I might be pulling in the price of a cryptocurrency and having a ticker on that. I might have my music controller for Spotify. I might have all kinds of other data. On my own build, I have a really cool weather radar, just like what they show on TV, that's constantly playing the radar information, and that's really cool to be able to look at. And from there are some predefined card types. There's I think there's like 8 or 9 of them, and you kind of just fill them in with the kind of data you want, and it's very adaptable and really nice to work with. But there are definitely ways of creating new layouts of cards and different cards entirely. But I'll talk about that a little bit later. If you are curious how this works, these are all fully interactable. If you go to this link at the bottom, just demo.homeassistant.io, you can actually just play around in this this home. You can do some cool stuff. You can click on the camera views and see a fake camera view. You can try arming their alarm system and kind of just get a feel for what you might be able to build. But it gets super complicated, and there's so many rabbit holes with it that I really don't want to spend too much time and get sidetracked talking about it. So installation. There's a billion different ways of installing Home Assistant. You can put it into a virtual machine. You can run it as a Docker container, and you could build it from source and use it as an operating system exclusively. But the kind of the tried and true method that works best for most people is using Hassio. And Hassio can be run on a Raspberry Pi, I think from 2 and up. I think I've seen people run it on Pi Zeros, but you get what you pay for when you use lower power devices like that. But essentially, when I say anything that you'll need, obviously this is a recommendation. You can always figure out some other way that might suit you better. But generally the way I explain to people how you set it up is usually get a Raspberry Pi 4B. The 2 gig RAM or 4 gig RAM generally work fairly well. You won't have any kind of problems. There is an 8 gig of RAM Raspberry Pi, but at this time of writing this presentation, it's not supported. So, you know, they'll eventually get it, but you'll have to wait some time for that. I recommend a really fast micro SD card. Not all SD cards are made the same. One of the cheap like Micro Center ones are not anywhere as fast as, say, the Samsung Evo cards or the SanDisk Extreme cards. Those are usually the ones I recommend, and I would say about 64 gigs of memory or of storage, but it supports as big as you can get it. So, you know, that'll be one of your limitations eventually, but I've never hit a limit with my 64 gig SD card, and I've been running it for about half a year in this current iteration. With the Raspberry Pi 4, they get hot. The older revisions didn't really get hot, but these can get quite hot, and you'll start to hit thermal throttling if you're not doing something about it. So I highly recommend a passive or an actively cooled case. There's some really nice ones. Some of the passive ones are made entirely of aluminum, so the whole case is a giant heat sink, and other ones just have large fans. If you're really interested, I have some links to some really nice ones that you can follow afterwards. Or if you're just looking at what's available, there's some great ways to do it. A kind of a caveat about Raspberry Pis are the power supplies. The latest Pi 4 has some problems with the power delivery spec that they use since it's USB-C. So I highly recommend getting a power adapter that is made specifically for it. Either the official one or the Connecticut power supply work really well. I've had trouble using things like my MacBook power supply or a USB one, and that just ensures that it'll always run at its best, the best it can, and it's not getting, you know, browned out or it's not getting enough amperage. Then for software, you only really need 2 things, or maybe even 1. And I usually recommend Bolina Etcher. It's a really nice image, an imager. You take the image and you put it in there and you specify the device and it flashes it. Basically no trouble. If you're familiar with DD or other tools like that, works the same. But I don't think you'll get as much support if you need help doing that, and you could probably mess up some stuff. So, you know, whatever you're more comfortable with. And you'll only need 1 other file, and that's the Hassio image. It's just a .img file. You can get it from the link there. Just make sure you get it for the right device that you're going to install it in. So I mentioned Hassio. I just talked about it. And I just wanted to clarify what that is. Hassio is kind of a managed Home Assistant ecosystem. It runs what they call the Home Assistant core, which is just the base bare bones functionality, as well as a Docker supervisor. And it's all inside Home Assistant OS, which can also be run in Docker. You can have Docker in Docker, and you can get some really crazy configurations, especially if you have a home lab or you're running in some kind of server environment. But the really cool thing is Hassio leverages Docker, so you can easily install related projects like Plex or Node-RED or some of the other really useful tools that will really benefit your Home Assistant experience, and usually just maps them natively to your sidebar in your UI. For example, like the File Explorer is a add-on that uses Docker, and you can just click on it and it brings you to a file explorer of your build. So really useful. You don't have to use Hassio to get these features, but it just works out of the box. So for new people, I always recommend it. Here's some really cool things that I encourage a lot of people to install when they first get up and running. The first thing is called HACS, and they call it Hacks. And it's kind of a third-party integration store. It has all kinds of stuff from like custom Lovelace cards that people create to app daemons that can add some really interesting like background features, like the ability to trigger a Spotify playlist being played on a Google Home or Amazon Echo device. Without that, it can be kind of tricky to get an instance of something like Spotify running on those. Some of those integrations really can do some really cool stuff. One of those integrations is the mail and packages integrations, which is really cool. It allows you to track shipments from UPS, USPS, FedEx, and Amazon. Basically, all it does once you set it up, it connects to an SMTP server and filters out emails from these providers. So if you sign up here in the US, if you sign in for informed delivery from a USPS, you'll usually get emails about all your different packages. And it basically takes that information and it puts it into nice serializable formats. So you can have a binary sensor that says something is being delivered today. You can have one that says something was delivered from there. And you can also have an analog sensor that tells you about exceptions during the shipping process. So I figured that's something that's fairly universal for most people. Everyone gets mail to some degree or Amazon, and it's free. And you know, if you don't really have a lot of data sources to play with, that's one that you can kind of play around with starting out. So this is an add-on from the Hassio add-on store. It's called Portainer. If you've ever used a Docker, Portainer is kind of big in that community, and it allows you to seamlessly configure and administer over your Docker containers. You can pull images, you can build images, and you know, have a really nice way of interacting with running ones if you're not super comfortable with the command line. And it's really nice for that. Additionally, the file explorer is like, you have to have it in my opinion, because there is a lot of configuration that you still have to do file-based. It's getting better over the years. They're adding it like user experiences for most of these configurations, but it'll be a while until everything can be done that way. So being able to upload files, pull files down, and edit things from your web UI is super nice. And finally, ESP Home. This is also another add-on. Allows you to map ESP-based microcontrollers straight into Home Assistant. So if you're tinkering with circuits, most ESP devices are Arduino compatible, and using ESP Home, you can easily you know, hook up your microcontroller to talk to a sensor, and you can map it directly to what kind of device archetype you want, pull it in, and it just acts like even commercial versions of those sensors. So definitely something to look into if you're interested in that kind of stuff. And then some other kind of cheap ways to get started with, this isn't just Home Assistant, but smart home stuff in general. As I mentioned before, the Amazon Dash buttons, you can get them for about somewhere between $3 and $5 a piece on eBay. To most people, it has like little to no value because the program was discontinued. But if your router is capable of preventing MAC addresses from connecting to the internet, you can follow, there's tons of guides on how to do it. You basically just block the MAC address of the button so that it can connect to your LAN, but it can't talk to Amazon. And then you can have an add-on called Hassio that when you press it, it can trigger an automation or set a state. So for a while, I used one of these as a doorbell because I figured, you know, it's $3. I have a ton of them. If somebody walked away with one, who cares? It's no big deal. I doubt anyone would. They'd say, what is that? But it's super nice I have a ton of them, and I put them in all kinds of places. I have one at, like, under the bed that's a panic button that could set off our security, my DIY security system. I have one at my my computer here that can adjust my desk lamp, and you know, you can configure these to do anything. You could have one, when you press it, it tweets something, or, you know, really anything. And once you get in that mind space of like what you can do, they become like super valuable to you. Additionally, things like Google Home Minis, Echo Dots are really cool because not only are they great standalone with, you know, with the Google Assistant or Alexa, you can easily configure them to act as autonomous speakers and do things like text-to-speech, other things like that, which is really cool. And then another kind of cheap sensor to get you into the realm of sensors is the Wise Sense Kit. You might not be familiar with Wise. They're kind of smaller. They usually make a lot of these low-cost security or webcam, not webcams, but security cams. And those are also cheap. They're like 25 a piece, and they integrate pretty well. But their sensor kit is about 15 bucks last I checked, and it comes with 2 door sensors and a motion sensor. It uses a proprietary protocol, but it comes with a little bridge that you're supposed to plug into the camera. You just plug it into your Raspberry Pi and install the add-on, and it suddenly magically maps those into Home Assistant. So if you just want to play with that, that's really a great way to start. And finally, if you're here in DFW and you can get to a Micro Center, Micro Center sells an ESP8266 starter kit. I don't know if it'll show up. It looks like this. It comes with an ESP01 development board, some LEDs, some resistors, a breadboard, and a wire, and some wire. And it basically allows you to play around with the ESP microcontrollers, which again play super well with Home Assistant. And the problem with usually procuring those is finding the programmer board that works out of the box. Usually you have to get them from China, and they're usually hit or miss. These work really well, and you only need to buy the kit once. You can just buy additional ESP01s for a couple of cents from AliExpress and maybe like 25 cents from Amazon. And if you're even just curious about it, a great way to start. And there are plenty of other boards that are more feature-proof or feature-packed. But if you're just looking to getting started with it, can't go wrong with it. This comes to one of my favorite parts of this is the community showcase. You know, the community is awesome. They are always trying to one-up each other with cool things to show off and new add-ons for everyone to use. But here are some of my favorite. This is a COVID-19 dad status board. So, you know, we're all working from home and living with family or your spouse or whoever it can be. You know, it's kind of uncharted territory. And we've gotten better at it, but it's still kind of a whole new experience. So this guy made this little picture frame thing with 2 lights, and it tells his kids when he's in a meeting and when he's wearing headphones, and it's all powered by Home Assistant. He didn't say how he made it, so I could only guess what the internals look like, but just taking a stab at it, it's probably an ESP board that has a battery, or I don't really see a wire, so it's probably just powered off of a battery, and it controls the status of those lights, and Home Assistant can just trigger it. So maybe he has a Slack command that he runs, and he has a Slack bot that tells it to Home Assistant or Discord, or I think he mentioned something about a Zoom process manager he has on his computer, and when a Zoom meeting starts, it'll fire an event to Home Assistant, and when it ends, it'll also fire one that says it's over. But you know, I think that's really neat, and it's kind of a cool way to adapt to this situation. This is kind of a more avant-garde type project. it was originally called the Voodoo Dollhouse, but it's a 3D printed floor plan of his house. And when you click on any of the buttons, it actually affects his real house. You could definitely play with a lot of features of that. It's not really practical, but it kind of shows off the versatility of this platform. Back when toilet paper was super scarce, this is one of the things that came out. And to this day, people are still trying to figure out the best method for quantizing how much toilet paper they have in their house. This is one particularly inventive solution. It uses load cells under it, and it weighs it to determine how many rolls are on there, and it automatically updates through his web UI how many rolls there are. So theoretically, you could build an automation with this hardware that says if there's one roll left, you know, you could add it to your grocery list. You could send an email. You could write some crazy script that just goes to Amazon and orders it. So you could have your own like dash button alternative. You know, sky's the limit with that. Another really cool concept that has a lot of different takes is a time of arrival at work or whatever, but creating some kind of home installation that doesn't necessarily show numbers or any kind of like readable data, but instead maps data to you know, colors, brightnesses, or otherwise. So this is just a simple, you know, it's just a light connected to Home Assistant, probably wirelessly through an ESP device, and it uses the Waze traffic API. It just pings that, and from there it determines what the traffic to work would look like. It's not super practical given how we're living right now, but hopefully one day when we get back to it, something like this would be more practical. But this kind of speaks to a bigger trend, like I had mentioned. You can build all kinds of really cool stuff, especially if you have like a laser cutter or you have some woodworking skills. You could build whatever, and it could be fully smart without having to have any kind of real like heavy processing on board. You kind of just offload that to Home Assistant, and you know, from there you can start branching out and even building like ambient computing devices that maybe do think about one type of job or process exclusively, and it just talks to Home Assistant. So you're not bogging down your Raspberry Pi with something. This is a custom alert panel. I think this is really funny because there's a lot going on here and kind of a lot of backstory that's just in this image. So this device can say, can display statuses, and there's just lights behind plastic, and it diffuses. So there's alert, there's put the ducks away. I guess they own ducks or something. A laundry done and check mail. And this is all powered by Home Assistant. So it just sends a message to the device and says, hey, this event happens, you should light up this section or multiple sections. There's also a bell, like an analog bell attached to it that will ring. And they even have a speaker built into it that plays through the gramophone speaker portion of it. It's pretty cool. I like the wood and the very retro aesthetic of it. And, you know, these might not be particularly useful to you, but these should serve as inspirations for the kind of things you could be building. And this final one is a bit more technical. It's a custom temperature sensor with an integrated LED sensor, LED display. This is 3D printed. It has a button, and it has an exposed temperature and humidity sensor, and just a really nice little display, not too overly complicated, very minimalist. And he could just stick those all over, and not only are they telling you at a glance the temperature, it's also posting this data to Home Assistant, making your AC and other air conditioning systems more intelligent about what's actually going on in your house. So that's really the crux and the end of what I'm going to be talking about. If there's any Q&A, we don't really have a lot of people here, but if there's any questions, feel free to ask me. Otherwise, you can reach out to me. I'm sure you can find me in the Slack or even in the comments here on Meetup if you have any questions about that, or maybe you have a project you're working on and maybe you're curious how Home Assistant could fit into that. I'd be happy to talk to you about that. And that's really it. And
Thank you very much, Cameron. We actually have a couple of questions, or at least one question over in the chat. It's from Iqbal. I don't know, would you like to just ask it?
Yeah, thanks, Luke. So I just, first of all, thanks for the very good presentation. I didn't know much about the HA and what all it can do. So I was thinking, like, is it compatible with any of the backend cloud services I may want to use? You know, the thing is, like, suppose I build a project of my own, like, let's say, weather station in my yard or something, but ultimately I want to link it to some kind of backend service using any of the cloud services. Build my own application, post in the cloud to just send me notifications or do other stuff. Does it have relevant APIs for that, or is it just a standalone cloud-free kind of solution?
so definitely the exacts about how you would go about actually integrating it, there's hundreds of different ways you could do it. Weather stations are something that a lot of people in the community use and work with. I'm gonna actually stop sharing my screen here, but you could definitely, if you're going cloud first and you're talking to, say, AWS, I don't really know too much about like the pre-built ingest systems that you would probably be using. But if you're rolling your own system, you could definitely be making API calls to your house, to your Home Assistant instance, whether that be running on-prem in your house or somewhere on like AWS or Heroku or whatever. Through traditional REST API calls, you could definitely do it. But you're probably wanting something a bit more robust. Home Assistant natively integrates with MQTT and other like broking services. So you could definitely make a call with MQTT to your Home Assistant. But personally, if you were doing that, I would build it directly with Home Assistant in mind, building and talking through your LAN, if you have the option of being able to connect the station to LAN, talking directly to Home Assistant and letting its multi-threaded system handle sending out the data to your cloud services, if that answers your question.
Yeah, so I know, yeah, because I've done some projects with MQTT, like a surveillance camera or something where I used OpenCV on the device, Pi4 based. But there, my backend is cloud actually. I'm using GCP for the backend.
Yeah.
For archiving, everything very intensively used. And then if you do like that, then there's an aspect of security too. You know, you have to secure information while it is on the device or when it's motion going to the cloud itself. For that, then you have to use that OpenSSL, all that stuff. So my question is, does HA have inbuilt support for like security, that kind of security, defense in depth kind of thing, where it's private information? You don't want to expose this to any outsider, you know?
So so Home Assistant is piecemeal at the end of the day, so you can configure it to work with anything you want. You could have it set up on a custom VPN so that only your cloud servers can communicate with it directly. You can be using a reverse proxy with Nginx and securing it with SSL. Or, I mean, there's all manner of systems. It would be the same way that you would secure any other kind of application. There is some consideration you have to think about when running anything on-prem, especially if it's in your house. Like if your internet provider provides the ability to open, to port forward, which is something I've struggled with in some places I've lived. My go-to solution for making sure, like critically securing these kind of applications is just to use a VPN. or some kind of SSH tunneling into a bigger VPN pool. I personally use a service called Zero Tier, and it allows you to create peer-to-peer VPNs that are very secure and very fast, and it's supported on basically any platform. So you know, when I spin up a Debian instance in like DigitalOcean or anything, and I wanted to talk to it, I would just connect them both to the same VPN and let them connect through that way. But there's probably some very like specific integrations and configurations that members of the community have worked on. So I'm sure if you went to any of those forums and asked like people who are doing this, how do you go about securing it, they would probably have their own methods and potentially some really good insight. Most of the kind of applications I run with my setup are usually very esoteric and don't have a lot of like security implications. Like I use SSL, but outside of that, I really don't worry about that. So I'm not really the best person to answer that question, but I hope I could help with that.
No, thanks. You gave a lot of useful information, Kemal. Thanks for that.
Well, I think that was really great. I've been building up a few little smart home devices, but I totally get you've got all these different ecosystems. All the different manufacturers are still trying to they want to own the space, even though they don't have everything in the space. And so you end up having to use one app to do this and one app to do that. And I totally see the value in it. It's just a matter of time of pulling something like this together, but it looks like it's pretty straightforward. And yeah, definitely the price is hard to beat. It's like, I'm pretty sure I have a Raspberry Pi laying around somewhere in the house that, like is not being used. And so it's really, really nice. So I'd say that's a great introduction. Love hearing more about it. Keep us updated on if you come up with some cool integrations or it'd be really neat to see how it works for you going forward. And I really appreciate you sharing all this with the community. I think we all really enjoyed it. And yeah, so that kind of concludes our official meetup. And so thanks everybody for coming out. Keep an eye on our meetup page for the YouTube video link and the next meetup that we have. And feel free to reach out if you've got ideas for a presentation. And with that, I will stop the recording and we'll say goodbye to everybody.